I recently went to Prague, so let's look at some pictures and videos and talk about impressions. Legend has it that Princess Libusche prophesied that there was going to be a great city on this site, and they started building. She was under pressure to marry, so she decided to marry a common farmer named Przemysl. This was all in about the 9th century, and that's when Prague, as we know it, was essentially founded. The dynasty that they founded would last about another 400 years, at least until Charles IV. And I had heard the name Przemysl before, but it was a Polish castle, the site of some brutal fighting during World War I don't think it's related, unless it's related to people later in their dynasty. But the two of them, Princess Libusche and Przemysl, were the founders of the city. Mainly her, less so him. The Przemysl dynasty that they would found lasted for at least another 400 years because Charles IV was a member of that dynasty. Charles IV is important because he is the center of virtually everything in Prague. The Charles Bridge, Charles University, Prague Castle, which was actually started in around 900, but he laid a lot of the groundwork on it. The Cathedral of St. Vitus, which is the famous cathedral there in Prague Castle, he had a lot to do with the construction of that. Charles IV is everywhere in Prague. And who was he? Well, he was the Holy Roman Emperor in the 1300s. And he's the one who moved the capital of the Holy Roman Empire to Prague. And I giggle every time I say Holy Roman Empire because, and I wanted to work this in when I was talking about the Saxon electors of Dresden, but I just didn't get around to it. But I laugh when I hear Holy Roman Empire because it reminds me of what Voltaire said, that it was neither holy nor Roman, nor even really an empire. And despite all the snark, it's kind of true, but it's one of these naming conventions that just happens over and over again. You hear a name that bears nothing of a resemblance to the subject matter. Kind of like all of the Democratic Republic of wherever, you just know it's not democratic and it's not a republic. Or any bill put before Congress, the Protection of Education Act, you just know it's really designed to destroy education, not protect it. Okay, but enough sarcasm. And I hated to jump 400 years and check history, but let's do it again. Talk about another favored son of Prague, Franz Kafka. I said that you see Charles everywhere you go in Prague. There are signs of him everywhere. Much the same with Kafka. I think he lived everywhere in Prague. We must have passed his house 4 to 5 different times. There's a sign that says Franz Kafka House. 4 or 5 different times in different locations. Every place he ever laid his head has a plaque outside. They love him that much. And it's kind of fitting because that Kafka-esque, unnecessarily complicated, frustrating labyrinth of bureaucracy and entrapment of that circular reasoning, often our own, not just authoritarian, is so appropriate for Prague because Czechoslovakia would live under both the Nazis and the communists for a large part of the rest of the 20th century, which had already bewildered Kafka in its early stages. I mean, it's almost like he knew what was coming. Somebody who's more familiar with his work than I am would be better suited to make an analogy, but I think there's one there somewhere. That Kafkaesque existence under the Nazis during World War II came about not in a city that was bombed and destroyed by war like much of Europe. Prague was probably the largest city in Europe not destroyed by bombing and fighting. There were bombs dropped, but not, I hate to say this to the people of Prague, but not that many. It was largely unscathed compared to other places. Doesn't mean the existence was nice, but the actual city itself survived, even though a lot of its citizens, mainly the Jews, didn't. Like most countries occupied by the Germans, most of the Jews didn't survive. It was a similar story. The confiscations, then the ghettos, then the death camps. Fortunately, there are a couple of things that exist from the Jewish quarter. One of which is the Old New Synagogue, which is from the 13th century, and the Jewish cemetery, in which there are 20,000 gravestones, but about 100,000 people. They're layered on top of each other, in some places 12 deep. That Prague that survived the war survived largely because there wasn't a fight. Well, not much of one anyway. The reason is most of it was given away. First by the Munich Agreement in 1938. Remember appeasement, Neville Chamberlain, all that. And then the Poles and the Hungarians moved in and took some more land. Then Slovakia seceded. And then the Nazis took what was left. It's all relative, but relatively speaking, it was all without much fighting. Czechoslovakia watched from a distance, mind you, because they weren't invited, the Munich Agreement, or the Munich Betrayal as they call it, as the Allies just gave Hitler the Sudetenland. And granted, it was largely full of Germans, but still, they just gave it away. And then the Poles took a little land, the Hungarians took a little land, Slovakia seceded, like I said, and then the Nazis just moved in and took it. Why did the Czechoslovakians allow this to happen? How did this happen? They didn't have much of a choice, and it was pretty obvious. All of their defenses were built in the Sudetenland to defend against a German invasion. That was just given away. They didn't have much of a defense left, and it just de facto became Nazi-occupied territory. It was just that chip away, and at no point were people able or willing to stand up and say no and fight. There was never really that opportunity. It just was chipped away, and then nothing was left. It's during that Nazi occupation that one of my favorite stories of World War II takes place. And it took place in Prague. It was the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, the Butcher of Prague, in 1942, Operation Anthropoid. He was the highest-ranking Nazi to be assassinated in any covert op during the war. And Heydrich was one of the worst of the worst. He was one of the darkest figures in Nazism. He was a true believer in the final solution. In fact, he was at the Wannsee Conference himself. Hitler referred to this guy as incredibly dangerous and the man with an iron heart. Yikes. I mean, even Adolf Hitler referred to this guy that way. 3 Czech soldiers parachuted in to Czechoslovakia behind enemy lines with the help of the British and with some British soldiers. And they worked for months with the resistance. And they eventually ambushed Heydrich in Prague in his car when he was driving to work at Prague Castle. It was actually their 3rd attempt. The first 2 fell through, but they finally got him. One of the Czechs went out with a Sten gun and it jammed. He stood right out in front of the car and the gun jammed. Heydrich and his driver figured out what was going on and they started firing at the guy. And they didn't see a second assailant who threw a bomb at the car and it blew up, injuring Heydrich severely and the driver, I believe. The gunfight continued. The guys ran away. Heydrich was injured. He would die several days later. There's actually still speculation to this day as to whether Heydrich died from the bomb or from blood poisoning. And the blood poisoning would have come from other German officers with whom he had feuds. He was a highly political figure and had enemies, even in the high-ranking German circles. Like Himmler himself hated this guy. And so did Canaris, who was the head of the Abwehr. They had actually just had a fight several days before this had happened. That's Canaris. And nobody really knows, but either way, the Czechs were the ones who were punished for it. 2 whole villages were razed to the ground with bulldozers, ceased to exist. All the inhabitants were deported or executed. In all, some 13,000 people, I believe, were arrested, and I think 3,000 were executed just because of Reinhard Heydrich. After World War II, there was a communist coup in 1948, and Czechoslovakia ended up part of the Eastern Bloc. That whole story is a mess, but that's for another time. But fast forward to 1968.
Building is beautiful, and we will see some nice interiors. There's a lot of filming actually at the main railway station. You see our main railway station.
If the symbol of Prague isn't Charles Bridge, then it's this, the astronomical clock. It's from 1410, and it is an absolute masterpiece of mathematics, scientific knowledge, engineering, and artwork. The legend is that the maker was getting offers from all over Europe to make similar clocks, and the town councilors were jealous, so they blinded him with a hot poker. I really hope it's not true, but it sounds like the kind of thing they would do in the 14 and 1500s. The clock really fits with the style of Prague, its whole personality. Underlying everything in Prague is this weird, wacky, home of the occult, esoteric, mystic, magical alchemy from the 14th century onward. I can't describe it very well. I can't put my finger on it, but it's certainly not something that's hidden or my observation alone. This is clearly something the city has embraced, and you see it everywhere, and it really gives the city a neat character. I wish I knew more about it, but it's a fascinating quirk to Prague, and it helps with its identity. This book sculpture in the Prague Municipal Library is a good example of the character of Prague. Lots of character. And it's quirky and weird and different. Certainly not boring. Certainly not run-of-the-mill. For some reason, to me, it just speaks to Prague and the kind of city it is. I really enjoyed Prague. It's certainly the kind of city you could spend years getting to know. And here we've got some pictures of Olomouc and Kratná Hora to end off the video. But Prague, to me, deserves its reputation as a world-class city. Some places don't, in my opinion. Prague definitely does. It's worth going to, it's worth going to again, it's worth getting to know, it's worth just taking your time to get to know. Whether you're a history buff, culture, society and cafe society, or whatever it is you enjoy, you're probably going to find it in Prague. And I didn't even really address the modernity of Prague. What Prague is today as a modern city. That's a fascinating subject as well. And a younger generation would do a much better job of telling you what a cool city Prague is. There's a big club scene, restaurant scene, cafe scene, a big social scene in Prague. But that's not really my deal.